The Israeli-Palestinian conflict escalates beyond Gaza, with clashes now spreading to the West Bank. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Israeli military continues a major offensive in Gaza while more rockets have been fired into Israel by Hamas militants. The conflict is also escalating, with clashes between Israeli troops and Palestinians spreading across parts of the West Bank. Meanwhile, in our other big story in Colombia, a wave of anti-government protests that began late last month continues. More than 40 people have been killed and hundreds injured in the crisis. Later in the program, we will have a perspective on the critical situation there from former Colombian ambassador to the United States, Carlos Urrutia. But we begin with the latest on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Joining me now from Virginia is Khalil Jahshan. He is the executive director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. With us, too, is Matthew Brodsky. He is a senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. And also with us is Jonathan Broder. He is a contributing editor at Congressional Quarterly and SpyTalk, and he's covered the Middle East for many years. Welcome to all of you to the show. Khalil Jahshan, let me start with you, and let's look at the situation right now. More than 120 Palestinians have been killed in these Israeli attacks, including 30 children and 10 women. 6 Israelis have also been killed from those rocket attacks from Hamas. There's no signs of this ending anytime soon. President Biden here in Washington has said that he doesn't believe that Israel is overreacting. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think your information is correct. Thus far, at least the magnitude of victims has exceeded the 120 dead on the Palestinian side, 7 or 8 on the Israeli side. Wounded, you're talking about at least 500 on the Israeli side, and double that on the Palestinian side. The exchange in violence is continuing. It has shifted places. Initially, of course, it started with Sheikh Jarrah and the Haram al-Sharif, or Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, moved to Gaza as Gaza kind of intervened in this conflict. And then now it's moving back, at least today, with regards to the demonstrations that we have seen in the West Bank. Plus, of course, all kinds of demonstrations and violence within Israel itself in quite a few cities, particularly mixed cities, from the south all the way to the north, to the point where some Israelis, including even the president of Israel, warned of what he perceives as a potential civil war that is more dangerous to Israel's security than any outside enemy. So the situation does not look good. The U.S. has sent Deputy Assistant Secretary of State to the region to see if the conditions are ripe for a ceasefire. That's a departure from the past 5 days, where simply the United States leaned on its Arab allies, particularly Egypt, Qatar, on its European allies, on the United Nations, to pursue the negotiations. We will see if these efforts have produced enough progress to allow for the U.S. now to work out a ceasefire.
Matthew Brodsky, if we're looking at video at times over this past week of some of the violence that we've seen there. We see Israel has bombed Gaza. We see multi-story buildings collapsing, bombed to the ground. And as I just mentioned, a very high number of children have been killed, number of women have been killed. Israel says this will continue. There's a possibility there could be a ground operation in Gaza as well. How can Israel defend these actions with this kind of force?
Oh, very easily. The unfortunate reality is there's a split politically, obviously, between Gaza and the West Bank and Palestinian politics. And what you had, the precipitating event that led to this, was that you were going to have finally an election for the Palestinian Authority Mahmoud Abbas, the Fatah leader, has been had a 4-year term and is in his 16th year, was finally going to hold elections on May 22nd. And once it became clear that the polling indicated that Hamas would actually win due to Fatah's internal corruption and a lot of other issues that really Palestinians weren't going to vote for them, he decided to cancel the elections. When he did that, a lot of the Palestinians were very annoyed because clearly he had lost his mandate already to be in charge, leading the Palestinian Authority. That's what the point of the election was for. When that happened, there needed to be a way that they could distract everyone's attention, the Palestinian streets' attention. And what they did is end up in a contest between Fatah and Hamas as to who is better at taking care of Palestinian interests, which, as they define it, apparently, is using missiles, shooting missiles from Gaza. This is Hamas trying to say that it is better off protecting Jerusalem. And this is how this conflict began. Now, Israel, of course, is going to defend itself, and Israel goes through tremendous lengths in order to make sure that the minimum amount of casualties happens amongst civilians. They make phone calls to cell phones for people that are there, and they also do taps on roofs to tell people to get out beforehand, far more than any other military would possibly consider.
Yes,
the fact is,
but Matthew, Matthew,
shooting them
just a moment there, Matthew. Just a moment there. I mean, I get your point about Israel warning people where it is about to bomb, but we're talking about one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Gaza is congested, as we can see. We are seeing multi-story buildings collapsing.
Right. First of all, it's not one of the most congested areas on earth. Certainly, there are a lot of people there, but look at Hong Kong, look at New York, there's more people, okay? Number one. Number two, the point for Hamas is to target civilians in Israel from where civilians are.
Yeah.
When you're looking at high-rise buildings, they have certain offices or areas or rooms, which is where Hamas operates or has an intel unit or a rocket-making unit, any number of Hamas satellites there, and located in other parts of the same floor are families. This is why Israel goes through the trouble of trying to warn people. But look, this is a war that Hamas has pretty much foisted onto Israel.
All right.
So of course there's going to be casualties, and that's unfortunate. The thing is, from Israel's perspective, I'm sure they need to get to a point where there's at least going to be several more years of deterrence and to degrade Hamas's.
All right, Matthew. I want to move to Jonathan Broder. Jonathan Broder, do you believe that this war was foisted on the Israelis by Hamas? That it had nothing to do with the fact that shortly before the violence started, we saw Israeli police attack worshippers in a mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a very holy place for Muslims, and the fact that there was a court judgment that would see Palestinians being evicted from parts of Jerusalem.
Yeah, that's very much a precursor of this. These kind of issues of Israelis taking over Palestinian property has been going on for some time. But another thing that often gets lost in this is that the issue of Al-Aqsa is incredibly sensitive and explosive for both Palestinians and Israelis. It is the holiest site in Judaism, which leads some very nationalistic and religious Israelis to demand the right to pray on the Temple Mount. Up until now, Israeli law prevents them from going up there because they realize how sensitive it is. On the Palestinian side, this is the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. It's where Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven.
Yeah.
So it's very, very important. And when the Israelis, let's say, restrict the number of people who can pray on Friday in the middle of Ramadan, when tempers are already strained because they've been fasting all day, and the Israelis say that only 10,000 people can gather to pray, that offends a lot of people. I mean, there's a huge plaza around the Al-Aqsa Mosque itself, so those who can't get into the mosque can pray in the plaza. When they put a restriction on the number of people that could pray there, that created a lot of tension. When you combine that with the court order that ordered the expulsion of these families from houses in which they've been living since the 1950s, that added to the fuel to the fire. And there was a third thing as well, and that is there's a plaza outside the Damascus Gate, which is the main entry for people going into the old city, going to pray in the at Al-Aqsa. They restricted the number of people who could be there. So the flame or the tinder was already there by the time Hamas stepped in and decided to bombard.
Okay, Khalil Jahshan, you know, as we have seen in conflicts before, the conflict that is taking place right now, we see the blame game. The Israelis blame Hamas. Hamas and other Palestinians say that the Israelis are the cause of this. But should Hamas take some of the blame for the violence that we are seeing, the carnage that we are seeing right now in Gaza, after it fired rockets into Israel?
I don't think so. I'm not a fan of Hamas, and I'm not a defender of Hamas. They can defend themselves. But Hamas did not intervene in this ordeal known as the Sheikh Jarrah ordeal, and I call it the Sheikh Jarrah Intifada because essentially it's assuming the same probably impact for the present and for the future as the previous two intifadas in the West Bank. Hamas did not get involved in this process until very late in the confrontations between Israel and the inhabitants of the Sheikh Jarrah, the families that have been ordered to evacuate and eventually to be dispossessed of their homes. And then we had the clashes for several days throughout the month of Ramadan, and Hamas was silent throughout the whole process. So was the PA, and the PA, as a matter of fact, is still silent. To blame, you know, as if like Hamas started this, as many Israeli spokespeople, including Matthew, try to imply, is nonsense. The same thing with the exaggeration regarding the weaponry. I mean, I'm sure Matthew is aware of Israeli intelligence reports. Today, they just announced that about 1,750 rockets, so-called rockets, were launched from Gaza. 300 of them were duds. They landed in Gaza, according to the IDF. Okay. In addition to that, 90%, according to the IDF, were intercepted.
Okay, Matthew.
This exaggeration, as if like these are Patriot missiles or intercontinental missiles, but again, I'm not interested in the balance of violence.
Launch rockets at you and see how you like it.
But distorting facts about who started this, it's very clear who started this.
Khalil, what about Matthew's point that this, the primary reason this was triggered was because President Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, canceled elections?
I think, again, that's a red herring. As a matter of fact, I think it's the opposite. I think it's the Israeli elections that resulted in this. By the way, the Sheikh Jarrah issue is not new. It's been going on for 40 plus years. It's been in Israeli courts in and out.
Okay.
And what made it, I think, more of a confrontation is the fact that the settlers lobby that used to lobby against the inhabitants of Sheikh Jarrah have now become part of the government after the elections. So the Israeli elections brought this level of racism, this level of dispossessing the Palestinians to such an official level, being part of the coalition government that was before and is being formed, and caused this reaction on the part of the inhabitants of Sheikh Jarrah. And again, the sympathy that was voiced in their support. And that's what caused things to do. So I could argue that it is the Israeli elections and the bringing in of racist elements into the equation that accelerated this conflict.
Yeah, Khalil, Matthew, go ahead.
Yeah, just gonna try out just a brain game here. We'll try out a few sentences. Israel, because of COVID, had some restrictions near the Damascus Gate. So they had restrictions in place at the beginning of Ramadan that they took out of the way and got rid of within a week. Therefore, we launched 2,000 rockets at civilians. Let's try Sheikh Jarrah. As your other guest pointed out, this has been a matter that's been inside of Israeli courts. This isn't some form of land grab. It's actually a citizen who is going through the courts with documents that prove that, of course, that he lived there because he had the deed from which was Jewish ownership from 1867. And of course, there's a much longer story there, but you have that, and there 2,000 rockets we launched into Israel. Jerusalem Day, incidentally, we should talk about that because we're discussing about the Al-Aqsa Mosque, its importance on the Temple Mount here.
Matthew,
and the fact that Israel isn't allowed to pray on
correct.
All right, one at a time, please. Matthew, I have to move on, Matthew. We're running out of time, Matthew. I want to get to Jonathan Broder very quickly. Jonathan, how concerned should we be the fact that this violence has now spread to the West Bank?
Well, I think we should be more concerned that it spread inside of Israel. I mean, it's not surprising that it would spread inside the West Bank because that's where all the Palestinians live, at least those under Fatah control, in addition to Gaza, of course. But one of the most disturbing elements of this latest round of violence is the intercommunal violence between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs. The Arabs are citizens of Israel, and they live in a collection of mixed cities: Haifa, Acre, Lod, and cities in the south, Beersheba.
Right.
And there you have citizens of the same country. It's not Palestinian Arabs who are living under Israeli occupation.
Yeah.
These are full-fledged Israeli citizens. But they identify with their Palestinian brethren.
Yeah.
And there have been
Jonathan,
clashes that are very, very violent.
Right. I'm sorry to butt in, but we have run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us to talk about this. Thanks. We're going to turn now to Colombia. The country has seen a wave of anti-government demonstrations for over 2 weeks, and there's been a strong crackdown by police. I talked earlier about all of this with the former Colombian ambassador to the United States, Carlos Urrutia. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
These are nationwide anti-government protests that are taking place in Colombia right now. They began at the end of April. They began as a protest against proposed tax reforms by the government, but they've escalated into protests about larger issues right now. We've got the middle class involved, we've got students involved, we've got unions involved as well. Can you give us a sense of what the mood is like in the country right now?
Well, again, as you just mentioned, there have been almost 3 weeks of demonstrations. We need to understand that, first of all, the right to demonstrate, the right to protest is enshrined in Colombia's constitution. So citizens really feel that they have all the right to go out to the streets and demonstrate and attract the attention of the government. And that's what's been going on for the past 3 weeks. As you correctly point out, one of the first issues against which demonstrators were protesting was the issue of a tax reform. A tax reform, a very ambitious tax reform bill that was presented to Congress by the government, which attracted a substantial resistance, if you will, both on the part of citizens as well as the labor unions that were involved, the political parties, the politicians. Generally, there was a strong reaction against tax reform. I think the problem there was that it was bad timing of the government. Usually, a tax reform is brought to Congress when a government is starting its period. This time, we have an election coming up, a congressional election, as well as a presidential election in just 1 year. And so you can understand that politicians are really not ready to assume the burden of going out and campaigning while they are being signaled as having approved the tax reform. So it all started, the government started in the wrong foot with tax reform, and it attracted severe reactions from all sides of society.
And I guess we should add that that proposal has been now withdrawn.
It has. It's, in fact, one of the casualties of these demonstrations. The government was forced to withdraw the tax reform from Congress. They intend to present something, a much lighter version. The idea being that originally the government intended to collect something like the equivalent of $8 billion, and now it probably will be reduced to something between $3 and $4 billion, and not necessarily affecting the middle class, but rather trying to focus the burden on the richest sectors of society.
Now, millions of people, of course, have been hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. They've seen their incomes drop. They've seen unemployment soaring in the country. How much is that driving these protests?
Well, it's playing an important role. I think one of the problems was, or is, that the government failed to secure the required, number of vaccines. And the vaccination plan was late in starting and very slow. And that frustrated a lot of people also. Because you see, people have the perspective of what other nations are doing, mainly places like Israel and Chile and the United States that have been very successful in vaccinating large portions of society in just 2-3 months. Colombia was late in starting and was very slow. And so that brought a lot of people to the streets, clearly.
Now, getting back to the demonstrations themselves, there's been widespread criticism of the manner in which the police have handled these demonstrations. And this criticism has even come from the United Nations, especially the demonstrations that were taking place in the city of Cali. 40 civilians have been killed, 800 injured. Police have used very heavy tactics against demonstrators. People want the riot police disbanded. What can you tell us about that, and how is the government responding to this?
Well, again, as I started saying, part of the problem is that demonstrations, there were pockets of violent youths that deteriorated the whole, effort of demonstration in the streets, the protests. And what happened was that the police was called in, if you will, to try to control the violence, not to go against demonstrations which were peaceful, but rather against the small pockets of youth that were engaging in rioting and in looting and going against private property, and also they were attacking the police themselves. Yeah. So, the government, what is saying is, this is not, we did not instruct the police to go against the people. We didn't instruct the police to engage in violent actions. Rather, we have trained the police forces to respect human rights. This is a government that is really not a repressive government. This is an issue of things going bad because of excesses on the side of violent civilians on one side, and of course, violent reactions on the part of the police. And what the government is doing is it is commencing investigations against the policemen that have been signaled as being responsible for incurring in police brutality and excessive authority. And so there are already on course investigations against members of the police that have engaged in violent actions, members of the police who are responsible for incurring in excessive use of force. This is not a strategy on the part of the government. This is, the government did not entice the police to react generally against the people.
Now, just a few years back, the Colombian government and FARC rebels signed a peace deal. Is that in any way endangered by these protests if they continue?
Well, we hope not. We hope not. The new the party that was founded by FARC has been quite surprisingly, in fact, completely silent on the issue of demonstrations. They have not really engaged themselves in the demonstrations. They have not participated. There are some sectors of what used to be FARC that did not abide by the terms of the peace accord that apparently are supporting the demonstrations, and including they might be even engaging in supporting the riots and so on. But I do not think that the peace accord is at stake in this case. I think that the peace accord is going well, that the government is making an effort to implement it correctly. There is criticism because some people claim that the government is not doing everything that it should be doing to expedite implementation of the peace accord, but clearly the government is keen on advancing the peace accord, on fulfilling the compromises, the commitments that were made in the peace accord.
Is the government of President Ivan Duque confident that it will be able to get through this period? I mean, we have seen already the finance minister has resigned.
Yeah. Well, not only the finance minister, also the foreign minister resigned yesterday. Apparently, part of the problem for the finance minister is that he really lost the confidence of all the political parties and the government itself, and so was forced to resign, and there is a new finance minister already in place. The government, I think, will be able to come out of this, but will certainly need to make substantial concessions, both to society at large, to the demonstrators, by way of focusing more its efforts on social spending and in supporting the poorest sectors of society. But clearly, I think we will be able to come out of this, and we will soon be in a political campaign to elect a new Congress and a new president within a year's time.
Ambassador Carlos Urrutia, thanks for joining us, sir.
No, thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.